draws people. And so that's why I treat evangelism as a primary because I think that our ability to evangelize and the souls that are being won to Christ can honestly maybe even act as a little bit of a gauge for the judgment that God has on a nation. And this is kind of where I'll kind of go into my more spiritual thoughts on it. That I think that so long as we're doing evangelism and discipleship right, that God will draw who He so desires. And if that doesn't look like, I mean, practically speaking, enough people to begin to change society, then maybe that in of itself is God's judgment on that nation. That He would leave the nation as a whole to a reprobate mind. If that makes sense, if that tracks. And so, so God has, let me make sure this isn't important. We're gonna have to film TRC after. Okay, cool. Man, they are going crazy with this stuff. I do recording and stuff for Theos U or whatever, and they're just sending me schedule and recordings and all that stuff. But man, I think that in regards to this, I think that there's a possibility that judgment will be enacted on the United States through the vice of Christianity and Christian culture being diminished. Not that it completely removes, right? Because God obviously will always leave a remnant, but that they will fall on their own sword. And so that's kind of where I think that there's a little bit of a both and at play, where we do we maintain our responsibility as Christians to go out and evangelize, while also maintaining our responsibility as members of the American nation, and voting as we should, and campaigning and being active in the way that we should, for the things that we believe in. But ultimately, if that doesn't and there's people that have different takes on this, like Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm not sure if you've looked into this, but the amount of people who were of the Eastern Orthodox tradition of the faith in America, it's gone up by like 425%, from 600,000 to 6 million, which is nuts. That's insane. And there's some instances where people have left non-denominational churches and moved into more mainline traditional churches. And there's a reason for that. I think that mainline churches tend to do better at teaching over preaching, so to speak, and that's a whole other thing. But I think that it's definitely a possibility that cultural decay in of itself is God's judgment on a nation. And I think that the policies that it enforces is a really good example. I think that there are three primary instances I'm of the argument that would bring God's judgment on the nation and specifically America. And I would say that it was the removing of God from the schools, specifically the worship of God in the schools, would be the primary there. I would say secondarily would be Roe v. Wade, and then I would say third would be the legalization of gay marriage, which are all three explicitly amoral things to do. And how the nation on a secular level have come behind those policies, I'd be like, man, you're going to get judged for that. I think it's possible 100% to see that backtrack and see that change. But again, that comes through evangelism. If God's not drawing people to Him, then maybe that, like going back to my previous point, is the judgment on the nation itself. That God has decided that He is going to maintain a remnant, but not draw any more to Himself, and that they will fall on their own sword. And regretfully, will Christians kind of catch some of the splash effect of that? Absolutely. And that will happen. But as we've seen in the Old Testament, I think we still see in the New Testament, that God still judges nations. That still happens. In the Old Testament, God's previously chosen nation, Israel, they were God's chosen nation during that period, and God 100% still enacted judgment on them. And if He was willing to do that to them, how much more so is He willing to do that to a nation that is not His own, which is America, right? I think that there's a general principle that can be followed with nations, where if a nation chooses to honor God, God will honor that nation. If they choose to reject God, God will reject that nation. And I think it's as simple as that. That doesn't make any nation more chosen than one another. It's just a simple thing of obedience. And if you're disobedient to God, you will suffer consequences on this earth for it. And so I think kind of more of a spiritual take would be that I think the decay of the nation could be a sign of God's judgment. And I think that we'll only really know that for sure maybe about 100 years from now.
Yeah, no, I think that